I'm really interested in the economic aspects of applying generative AI across different business functions and how that plays out in terms of markets and relationships with partners and customers and across the different functions. So a few people have asked me if I could put together a short video of some of the challenger seminar sessions that I've been running for clients. And so what I've done is I've put together a few thoughts around how evolving baselines and assumptions need to change in terms of how we're planning, how we're executing against these new capabilities that are coming along, especially thinking about some of the newer aspects around simulation and holographics and all this kind of stuff. So here we go.
So welcome to the next Challenger discussion. And I want to talk in this one a little bit about assumptions and baselines and how they are being impacted in terms of the traditional ways we look and think about our businesses and our organizations. They're being impacted radically by generative AI, but also the next wave of things that are coming along, such as agents, simulation technology, embodied AI, robotics, for example. All of these things are about to impact many different types of organizations, whether they're startups, SMEs, corporates, public institutions, universities, research organizations. There's all these different kinds of aspects that are evolving at the same time. Lots of feedback loops between not just the technologies, but the use cases and how they're being applied by organizations, and also the dynamics between the different organizations themselves. So we want to jump into that a little bit. Now, traditionally, we all have a set of baked-in assumptions about how things have been done in our teams. They've evolved kind of like rock sediment over a long period of time, maybe in some cases only 5 or 10 years, but in other cases, in other industries, especially some of the bigger organizations, these assumptions of how things are done, how long they take, how much they cost, and how they're, of course, measured, how we are measured as employees. That's evolved over a long period of time. But right now, that's kind of up for grabs because of the impact that in the last year and a half, for example, LLMs such as ChatGPT and others have had on the way that we can actually create and distribute work. So let's just take this example of a typical generic organization. It could be a smaller one. It could be an SME with around 100 to 200 people, or it could be a bigger corporate organization. Let's use a commercial entity as an example. So you've got a bunch of different functions, and all of those functions do different things. They create content, they make decisions, they report, they execute, they implement, they service customers, this kind of thing. And they all have targets. Now, the question is, what happens when we start applying generative AI capabilities, whether it's combinations of modality, whether it's textual, whether it's image, video, audio, code generation, 3D objects? What happens when we start combining these rapidly emerging AI capabilities together to actually take over some of the work or augment the employees in the activities that we're doing? So all of a sudden, lots of really interesting things start to happen. Now, in a smaller organization, say an SME, 10 to 100 people, it's a lot easier to actually understand and track and maybe build a strategy around the implementation of generative AI across these different functional areas because of size and scale. But of course, in a larger organization, it's a lot harder to actually do that. So how do you actually keep control of this? And how do you understand what the actual overall implications for this transformation across the different functions on your entire business is? That's actually quite hard. And that's why it needs a lot of clear communication paths. It needs to be both bottom up in terms of testing the new capabilities, but at the same time, it also needs to be top down in terms of making sure that the way the work is shifting, the way the employee base is adapting to that, the way the measurements are evolving, the way the planning and the forecasting is evolving, and the assumptions of the old business are changing based on the rapidly unfolding landscape with these generative AIs in the organization. That needs to be clearly understood. And that is a serious transformational challenge. And it's also a challenge that's going to continue as new forms of AI continue to impact the way we do things. And of course, we're not operating in a bubble, so we're responding to the market, to customers, and also to business partners as well. And the dynamics between those different types of organizations, between the relationship of the partner and the customer, they're going to continuously change as well. So all of our traditional assumptions about how we plan our annual budgets or our 3 and 5 year strategies, they're all up for grabs right now. So what we need to do is develop this continuous process of change, both in the way the organization is structured, the business model, but also in the mindset of the leadership, the board, the stakeholders, the team leaders in the different functions, and especially in the employees. And that also has a big implication in terms of who and how we recruit people. It has implications on assumptions of how we decide to invest in something, whether it's a new function, whether it's doubling down on product development, whether it's making a merger or an acquisition or some kind of new partnership. So all of those assumptions need to be continuously challenged. Let's take one example around business assumptions and the impact of generative AI on, say, a project services organization. So maybe you've got an organization that creates projects, they create content, they make a bunch of deliverables for customers, and they have project plans like this. The red is a critical path within the project, and you can see the blue tasks are basically a bunch of floating activities, and there's a lot of interdependencies between those. And of course, they're constrained by resources and milestone dates and deliverables and things like that. So what happens when all of a sudden we can deliver some of those tasks in 30% of the time and cost that it traditionally took us? And that's because we're, say, utilizing ChatGPT or other forms of LLMs to actually execute that task faster. So what happens if we bring a task in a project down from, say, 2 months to 9 hours? What is the overall impact of that on the business? Now, on the project, it could have a big impact if it's on the critical path, shortening the entire project. But if it's on a floating activity, then it might not have such an impact. But what it can do is it can release a lot of capacity in terms of resourcing. The challenge is then, can you line up the organization and your resource scheduling system to actually capitalize on that freed up resource? Do you have the additional work lined up to take advantage of that? So that's one challenge. But then what happens if you have a lot of these different projects underway in your organization and you start making these massive savings and you're starting to accrue all of this extra capacity within your organization? How do you actually, understand that, and what do you actually do with all of that released capacity and also that additional time scale, and of course the margin that you're adding to the business, hopefully? So how do you track all of that? And then the critical thing is, how does all of this feed into your assumptions about what your business can achieve over the next 6 to 9 months to a year and a half? That's, for me, is one of the most interesting aspects of how we're applying these generative AIs to the organization. Not just in terms of, hey, yeah, we can create this new content in 9 hours instead of 2.5 months, but really, what's the macro opportunity, and how does that change all of the assumptions from HR to the CFO to the CEO to all of the different underlying operational aspects of our business, such as measurements and things like that. So we just talked about the potential savings and capacity improvements in the projects that a company might be undertaking for customers. But what about when we start also looking at the other functions? Say we look at the finance and operations team, by making use of, say, I don't know, Microsoft Copilot and other tools. What if they can suddenly reduce all of their workload to, 30 to 40%? What can they do with all of that released capacity? And how much more insights can they bring to the organization with that extra time, with that speed, with that extra capability that they've acquired through using these generative AI tools? And what happens on the same side, say in marketing and communications, in terms of the improvement in getting out content to the market, but also bringing down the cost because you can do it in-house. And the same with, say, HR and product development. So all of a sudden you've got an organization that's accruing lots of savings in time and cost and hopefully quality improvements, and driving a lot more maybe margin and revenue to the business, what's that doing to your overall assumptions of how you're running that organization? So it used to be in that if we wanted extra quality or improved quality in a certain product or a project, then there was a trade-off with time and cost. But now with these generative AI capabilities, we can actually have all three of them. So what does that actually do to our assumptions in terms of our budgeting, our investments, our skills requirements, all of these kind of things, as this continues to spin out across the business and indeed across the market, because we're not doing it in isolation. And the same with the revenue. So all of a sudden we have the opportunity to drive potentially both improvements in revenue and margin, and also double down on investments in other things because we're releasing so much extra capacity. So here's another way to think about it. If you take a look at the full glass on the left hand side, basically that could have been our annual budget and our resources for the business, for the organization, pre ChatGPT, pre generative AI impact on the organization. So we have a fixed set of resources for those functions for that business that we're running. But then what happens if we think back to the images I was just showing a minute ago, where we start realizing all of that extra capacity, those time savings, quality improvements? What starts to happen to the baseline of our business and our budgets, and how we're projecting the business going forward in terms of plans? How do we start thinking about the business and the opportunity, and what does that do in terms of our potential to move into new directions? And of course, this is just going to continue to go on because more and more forms of generative AI, we're going to get access to agents, we're going to get access to world simulation capabilities very, very shortly. Think about what's coming along with Sora and Genie from Google. So all of these things are going to be impacting different parts of the business, the markets, our competitive landscape, partnerships, things like that. So how's that going to shift how we plan and resource our organizations going forward? And what kind of implications does it have for HR, for career development, for the CFO, for the CTO, for all of these different functions who have their own sets of measurement systems in place and baselines? Another way to think about baselines and how you measure the potential growth of your organization is in terms of this kind of springboard trampoline effect, where by applying generative AI to all of these different functions, whether they're customer facing or their back office operational activities, what does that give you in terms of the potential to grow your business, in whether it's revenue, margin, whatever? So traditionally, before we started applying all of these AI capabilities to our operations, it was reasonable to maybe expect 10 or 15, 20% revenue increase or margin increase per year. And some organizations, of course, going for both, but that was pretty difficult unless you're a digital business and you've got these opportunities for significant scaling. Anyway, once you start applying generative AI to the different functions, you start finding these savings in terms of time and cost, and you're releasing capacity, and you're getting decisions done faster, you're ideating, your projects are accelerating. What does that mean in terms of your ability to spring forward significantly? So what kind of projections do you need to come up with in order to actually plan your business, to drive these conversations with your investors, with your stakeholders, with your board? So we need to really be thinking about this. But the problem is that we don't really have any kind of traditional baselines or measurement systems from which to do that. So I think that what's going to happen in terms of forecasting, but also in terms of timescales, and the gaps are going to come down on all of these. So I think it's going to come down to a maximum of 12 to 18 months, basically because there's so much dramatic change coming along the pike in terms of new capabilities, simulation, agents, all this kind of stuff, holographics, that it's impossible to predict. And that's why I think the baselines from which we measure our businesses and the assumptions from which we measure our businesses, they're going to have to change on a very, very regular basis. So Ghana these days, where we have, 5, 10 years of data from which we can actually predict or kind of set some kind of trajectory for our business, that's all gone out of the window. So essentially what this means is that now we're starting to apply generative AI across different aspects of our operation. What things are being done by us as employees and teams and functions, they're all going to change. Our employees and our teams are going to get augmented constantly by these new types of capability, and that will shift the way that workflows function within an organization and where indeed they're actually taking place and who does them. And of course, the cost and the time it takes to do all of these different things, that's going to constantly come down. What that will end up meaning will be that actually we'll start taking on a whole bunch of different tasks and different functions, which are pretty difficult right now to actually predict. But what it does is it opens up opportunities for people with pretty good imagination and intuition in terms of what's coming along to say, hey, we're releasing all of this extra capacity. We've got all of this capability inside our organization. We don't have to make additional investments. We don't have to make mergers or acquisitions. We can actually do quite a lot more. Why don't we start ideating in this direction and see if there's an opportunity where, because of the convergence of these technologies over the coming 18 months, we can actually get ahead of the game with our own existing resources. These kind of scenario plannings are going to be quite common, I think. And I think that people are going to start using AI simulation tools to actually help them be a lot more precise about what is possible here. So lots to look forward to in terms of the coming 2 years, probably, in terms of setting the new baselines and setting the new business direction for all of our operations.
So I hope you found that useful. It's, of course, a moving target. We have to keep our eyes and ears on this rapidly unfolding landscape that's coming at us across different functions, across the markets and everything. But if you like what you saw, please like and subscribe, and I'll be back with more insights very shortly.